Then, the temperature dropped to -42 degrees. This is January 1884. The Great Plains blizzard had been running for 19 days. Across the homesteads of North Dakota, people were burning everything they owned just to stay alive. Furniture, floorboards, fence posts. Newspaper accounts from that winter describe families found frozen inside their own cabins. Fires still going, rooms still full of smoke, but the floor, always the floor, was solid ice. One cabin was different. On a homestead about 12 miles outside of Minot, a Polish stonemason named Stanisław Kowalski had built something his neighbors had never seen before. No hearth visible in the room, no fire burning in the open. The chimney above the roof barely smoked. And inside, his children played barefoot on the stone floor. A conventional fireplace sends most of its heat straight up. The physics are simple, and they are brutal. Hot air rises. A standard firebox radiates maybe 10 to 20% of its energy into the living space below the ceiling. The rest goes up the flue and out into the blizzard. You can burn 400 pounds of wood a day, and the floor 3 meters from the hearth will still be frozen solid. Kowalski's neighbors were doing exactly that. 400 pounds of wood every day, and still freezing. So here is the question this video is built around, and I want you to hold it until the very end. Why were Kowalski's children playing barefoot at -42 degrees while his neighbors burned 400 pounds of wood a day and their floors were still frozen solid? In this video, I'm going to explain exactly how his system worked, not as folklore but as physics. And then I'm going to show you something that Kowalski himself never knew, that 3 other civilizations, separated by continents and centuries, had arrived at exactly the same answer. The last one might be in the floor of the room you're sitting in right now. This documentary is about 40 minutes long. We're going to move through 3 things. First, why conventional heating fails in extreme cold, and the one law of physics that explains it entirely. Second, how Kowalski's system actually worked, component by component, the exact engineering of it. Third, why the same principle appeared independently in ancient Rome, 15th century Korea, and a house in Wisconsin in 1937, and what that pattern means for the floor you're standing on today. Stay to the end. The last connection is the one that changes how you see your own home. The winter of 1883 to 1884 is documented in North Dakota's territorial records as one of the most severe in the region's written history. The cold did not arrive in a single blizzard and leave. It settled. Temperatures stayed below -20 Celsius for weeks at a time. Animals froze overnight in barns that had been built to withstand harsh winters. Creeks that were still running in October became solid ice 2 feet deep by November. And the homesteads, the small wooden cabins that settlers had built across the plains with single-room construction and cast-iron stoves, were simply not designed for what arrived that year. A correspondent for the Bismarck Tribune filed this account in February 1884. 3 families in Burleigh County have been found this week having burned the boards of their own floors in order to survive the night. In one case, a man and his wife were discovered frozen at their kitchen table. The fireplace contained the ash of what appeared to be a chair, 2 door frames, and a section of the kitchen shelf. The fire had gone out sometime in the early morning hours. That account was not reported as unusual. It was reported as routine. 400 pounds of wood a day. I want to be precise about that number. It is not a figure used for dramatic effect. 400 pounds was the documented average consumption for a standard homestead cabin in a severe North Dakota winter, based on supply logs from territorial merchants. 180 kilograms every day. That is a significant physical effort just to collect, cut, and haul. And it was not enough to keep the floor warm. Not 3 meters from the hearth. Not 1 meter. The reason is convection. Hot air is less dense than cold air. This is a measurable, consistent property of all gases, not a theory or an approximation. When air is heated, its molecules move faster, take up more space, and become lighter relative to the surrounding air. And lighter air rises. This is not a tendency. It is not something that sometimes happens. It is a physical law that operates without exception every time there is a difference in temperature between two adjacent bodies of gas. In a 19th century homestead cabin, a burning cast iron stove heats the air directly around it. That air rises immediately to the ceiling. It collects there. In a sealed winter cabin on a cold night, the ceiling temperature could reach 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor remained at 18 or 20. The upper half of the room, the half no one inhabited, was warm. The lower half, where people ate, slept and walked, was cold. Not uncomfortable, cold, below freezing, in severe conditions, even within a foot of an actively burning stove. A standard cast iron stove of the 1880s radiated roughly 10 to 20% of its combustion energy into the living zone, the space below shoulder height, where people actually worked, ate and slept. The remaining 80 to 90% was carried by the hot gases up through the stovepipe and exhausted to the outside. You were not heating your house, you were heating the sky above your chimney. The 400 pounds of wood your neighbors were burning every day, 80 to 90% of its energy went straight into the blizzard. Stanisław Kowalski was a stonemason. He was born in the Malopolska region of what was then the Austrian partition of Poland, probably in the late 1840s. He emigrated to the United States in the late 1870s and arrived in North Dakota around 1880, following a chain of Polish immigrant families who had settled along the Red River Valley. He was not an engineer, he had no formal training in thermodynamics, but he had spent his entire working life building and maintaining heat systems, bread ovens, kiln chambers, smoke channels, hearth foundations for other people's homes. He understood heat the way a craftsman understands materials, through repeated hands-on observation over many years. Kowalski had watched bread ovens in Poland hold their warmth for 12 hours after the fire went out. He had built smoke channels that, when shaped correctly, extracted far more heat from the same quantity of fuel, because a winding path slows the gas down, and a slow gas gives up more of its heat to the surrounding stone before it escapes. He knew that stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. None of this was scientific knowledge in the formal sense. It was craft knowledge, accumulated observation that had never been written down but was no less precise for that. The question he applied to his cabin was not in the end complicated. If heat always rises, if there is no practical way to force it downward into the living space, then the source of the heat needs to begin below the floor, not beside it, not above it, below it, so that when the heat rises, it rises through the place where the family actually lives, at the feet, at the knees, at the body. This seems obvious once stated. It was not obvious to anyone around him. The standard response to a cold floor in 1883 was to add more fuel to the fire, which sent more heat to the ceiling, which changed nothing at floor level. More of the same wrong answer. Kowalski's response was different. Not more fuel, but a different position for the fire. Not beside the problem, but below it. The insight was not about combustion chemistry or material science, it was about geometry. Kowalski had been in North Dakota for 3 years before he built his system. The first winter, 1880 to 1881, had been severe enough to cause frostbite in one of his children. The second winter took 2 of his immediate neighbors, a couple from the adjacent homestead, found in February. By the spring of 1883, he had begun planning. Construction happened over the summer and early autumn, the only window before the ground froze again. He had one chance to get it right before winter returned. His neighbors thought he was wasting the last good weather before winter. Digging into the subsoil of a North Dakota homestead to install an underground heating chamber was, by the standards of the time, eccentric at best. A County Historical Society document compiled in 1912, drawing on oral histories from original settlers, records one neighbor's assessment in plain terms. Kowalski dug a hole under his floor and called it a furnace. We all laughed. They stopped laughing in January 1884. So what exactly did he build? Ron Kowalski's system had 3 parts. They were not separate inventions, they were a single logical sequence, each one only making sense because of the one that came before it. Remove any part, and the system does not degrade or become less efficient, it stops working entirely. This interdependence is what distinguished it from simpler attempts to heat from below, and it is what made it so robust in practice. Component 1, the firebox. The firebox, the combustion chamber where the wood actually burned, was placed approximately 1 meter below the floor of the cabin. This is the first and most fundamental departure from conventional design. In a standard stove or hearth, the combustion zone sits at or above floor level, at the height of a human knee or higher. In Kowalski's system, it was buried. The fire was lit from a small access opening at the exterior of the cabin. The combustion gases, the hot smoke, never entered the room at all. Why does burying the firebox matter? Because the further below the floor the heat source sits, the more stone you place between it and the living space. That stone acts as a thermal buffer. It absorbs heat from below, slows the rate at which that heat moves upward, and stores it. And because the heat is now starting below the floor, when it rises, it has only one direction available to it: upward, through the stone, into the floor surface, and then into the room, into the zone where people actually live. Compare this to a conventional stove. The heat enters the room at stove height, roughly a meter above the floor, and immediately rises to the ceiling. In Kowalski's system, the heat enters the room at floor level, 0 meters above the floor, and then rises through the entire height of the room. Every centimeter of vertical space was heated from the bottom up, not from the top down, not from the side and upward, from the very bottom, from the floor that people slept on and children played on. Component 2, the channels. The second component is what Kowalski referred to, in the one written record we have in his own words, a letter to a relative in Poland, dated 1887, simply as the passages. In engineering literature, they are called serpentine flue channels. Their function is heat extraction, not heat generation. The firebox handles that, not heat storage. The stone mass handles that. Extraction, taking as much heat as possible out of the combustion gases before those gases exit the building. When hot gas moves quickly through a straight pipe, it exits at high temperature. A large portion of its thermal energy is still in the gas when it leaves the building, carried out into the air, wasted. A straight flue is in essence an efficient exhaust system. It removes hot gas fast, which is useful if your only goal is to prevent the room from filling with smoke, but it throws away most of the energy you just burned. Kowalski's channels did the opposite. They slowed the gas down, maximized its contact time with the surrounding stone, and extracted as much heat as possible before the gas finally escaped. The channels in Kowalski's system ran approximately 12 meters in total beneath the floor of his cabin. For a floor area of roughly 30 square meters, a typical homestead single room, 12 meters of back and forth channel covered a significant portion of the underside of that floor. The channel walls were stone, typically 10 to 15 centimeters thick enough to hold heat, thin enough to allow the heat to transfer into the stone mass above. The path was not straight. It reversed direction multiple times, ensuring the gas spent as much time as possible in contact with the stone before exiting. Component 3, the thermal mass. The third component is the stone floor itself, or more precisely, the mass of stone between the channels and the floor surface. Engineers call this thermal mass, material with a high heat capacity that can absorb a large quantity of heat energy and release it slowly over a long period of time. Stone, granite, limestone, sandstone is well suited to this. It does not conduct heat as fast as metal, which means it stores more heat before it begins to lose it, and it releases that stored heat at a slow, steady, consistent rate. This is not a flaw, it is the mechanism. With a wood firing that took approximately 2 hours in the morning, considerably less fuel than his neighbors were burning in a day, the stone floor in Kowalski's cabin would reach a surface temperature of somewhere between 28 and 32 degrees Celsius. That is warm to the touch, comfortably so, not hot, not uncomfortable for bare skin, and it would hold that temperature for 8 to 10 hours, independently of any additional fuel. The fire could go out completely. The floor would remain warm until evening. Think of it this way, a straight pipe from fire to chimney is like a battery that drains as fast as it charges. You burn 4 hours of wood and get 4 hours of warmth, provided you can afford to keep feeding the fire around the clock. The serpentine channel system is like charging a battery. You burn the wood for 2 hours in the morning, but instead of exhausting that heat immediately into the sky, you capture it in the stone. The stone becomes the battery, and then the battery discharges slowly, not in 2 hours, but across the entire day, 8 hours, 10 hours, long after the fire has gone out and the access door has been shut. This is what it means to heat from below. The stone floor surface, not a single half point, but the entire floor, was between 28 and 32 degrees, and heat always rises. Every square centimeter of that floor was sending warmth upward into the room at exactly the height where human beings live, at the feet, at the knees, at the waist. The ceiling was not the warmest part of the room. For the first time in that cabin's history, the floor was, consider his neighbors again, 400 pounds of wood, 180 kilograms, every single day. The ceiling of their cabins was warm enough to cause condensation. The floor, 1 meter from an actively burning stove, could be at or below freezing. Kowalski fired his system for 2 hours each morning. He used a fraction of their fuel, and his 4-year-old child slept on the stone floor without a blanket. There is something worth pausing on here. Kowalski did not think of himself as having invented anything. He would not have used that word. He was a craftsman who had solved a practical problem using materials and principles he already understood from his trade. He built one system, in one cabin, for one family. He did not file a patent. He did not write a manual. He told his neighbor, the one who had laughed, how it worked.
That neighbor built a version of his own the following spring, and then almost nothing. The knowledge did not spread. It remained at the edge of the record, local and invisible. So let me put all three parts together before we move on. A firebox buried 1 meter below the floor. Serpentine channels, 12 meters of them extracting heat from the combustion gases as they move. A stone thermal mass that absorbs that heat and releases it steadily for 8 to 10 hours. The heat enters the room at floor level. It rises through the entire height of the room. It does this for most of the day from a single 2-hour morning firing. 3 components, 1 logical sequence, 1 physical principle, the same principle Kowalski had been working with his entire professional life. Heat always rises. He built a system that started the heat where a rise would do the most good. The children played barefoot because the floor was warm. The floor was warm because the heat had nowhere to go but upward through it. And it went upward through it because the fire that created the heat was below it. The system was not clever in a complicated way. It was correct. It started with the physics. Heat always rises, and it built everything around that single fact. Nothing in the system fought the physics. Everything worked with them. But here is the question I promised you would want to stay for. Kowalski did not read about this in a book. He reasoned his way to it from first principles, from observation and craft knowledge. Which means, if the physics are universal, and they are, then someone else should have found the same answer in a different time and a different place. And they did, not once, 3 times, independently, over 2,000 years. When a physical principle is genuinely correct, not just practical under specific conditions, but correct, different people in different places tend to find it independently. This is not a mystical idea, it is a pattern in the history of technology. The wheel, the bow and arrow, the decimal number system. When the problem is universal, the materials are available, and the conditions are extreme enough that a wrong answer becomes fatal. Human beings tend to converge on the same solution. What I want to show you now is that radiant floor heating, the principle of starting heat below the floor and letting physics do the rest, is exactly one of those solutions. Rome, circa 100 AD. The Roman Hypocaust, from the Greek hypocauston, meaning heated from below, was developed during the 1st century AD for heating bathhouses and the villas of the wealthy throughout the Roman Empire. The structure: a raised floor, supported by small stone or ceramic tile pillars called suspensurae, leaving a gap of roughly 60 centimeters beneath the floor surface. A furnace at one end of the building generated hot combustion gases. Those gases moved through the underfloor space, heating the suspensurae, the floor above, and vertical wall channels that carried heat further upward. The floor was warm to the touch. In bathhouses, room temperatures could reach 40 degrees Celsius. The Hypocaust was not identical to Kowalski's system. The Roman version typically required continuous stoking. It was less efficient at storing heat in a single thermal mass, but the core principle was the same. Combustion gases routed beneath the floor, heating stone, the floor radiating warmth upward into the room. Heat always rises. The Romans understood this. They built their solution around it. And they did so, as far as current archaeological evidence shows, without any knowledge of what a Polish stonemason in Mopolska would work out with his hands 18 centuries later. Korea, circa 1400 AD. The Korean Ondol system, Ondol, literally warm stone, appears in the archaeological record as early as the 1st century BC in the northern Korean peninsula, but its most developed form emerged between the 14th and 15th centuries AD. The design is precise and elegant. A cooking or heating fire is built in a separate chamber at one end of the house, at a level below the floor. The hot gases travel horizontally beneath flat stone floor panels, called gudol, and exit through a chimney built into the far end of the house. The floor warms from below. Korean families traditionally sat, ate and slept on the floor. The Ondol was not a supplement to their living space. It was the foundation of it. Ondol was developed without any known contact with the Roman Hypocaust. Korea and Rome had no documented exchange of architectural heating technology. And Kowalski, working in North Dakota in 1883, had no documented knowledge of either system. 3 engineers, 3 continents, 3 separate centuries. One principle: place the combustion below the floor, let the heat rise through the stone, and the floor will warm the people who live on it. The physics did not care who discovered it. They worked the same way in a Korean winter as they did in a Roman bathhouse as they did on the North Dakota plains. Wisconsin, 1937. In 1937, the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright began construction on the Herbert Jacobs House in Madison, Wisconsin. It was a modest house by design, affordable, democratic in intention, a demonstration that good architecture did not require wealth. Among its defining features, a concrete slab floor heated by hot water pipes embedded within it. Wright called the system gravity heat. He had first encountered the principle in Japan, where he had lived and worked between 1917 and 1922, and where floor-based heating traditions related to Ondol were present in the regional architectural practice. Wright recognized what he saw. He brought it to American residential construction and gave it a name. 54 years after Kowalski fired his underground furnace for the first time, a celebrated American architect reintroduced the same principle to Western residential construction. He gave it a name. He placed it in a building that is now on the National Register of Historic Places. He did not mention a Polish stonemason in North Dakota. He had almost certainly never heard of him, but the physics, heat always rises, and if you start it below the floor, it rises through the space where people live. Those physics had not changed. They never do. Radiant floor heating, the system now installed in tens of millions of homes across Scandinavia, Germany, Korea, Japan, Canada, and the United States, operates on the same three-component logic that Kowalski built by hand in 1883. A heat source, a distribution network beneath the floor, a floor material with sufficient thermal mass to store and release heat gradually. The specifics have changed. Hot water instead of wood smoke, cross-linked polyethylene tubing instead of stone channels, concrete instead of limestone. But the logic is identical. The physics are Kowalski's physics. They are Roman, they are Korean, they are the only physics that work. What this tells us, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, is something about the difference between knowledge and intelligence. Kowalski had no formal education in thermodynamics. He could not have named convection, thermal mass, or enthalpy. He did not know about the Hypocaust. He had never heard of Ondol, but he had something that formal training does not always provide. He had paid close attention to a specific physical reality for 30 years, and he had trusted what he observed over what he had been told to expect. The result was a solution that professional engineers in North America did not arrive at independently until 54 years later. Folk engineering is not inferior engineering. In some conditions it is the only kind that works, because it starts with what is true and builds from there, rather than starting with convention and defending it. So let me answer the question I asked you at the beginning. Why were Kowalski's children playing barefoot at -42 degrees, while his neighbors burned 400 pounds of wood a day and their floors were still frozen solid? Because his neighbors were heating the ceiling. Their fires were hot, their wood consumption was enormous, and their heat output was real, but 80 to 90% of it went upward, out of the flue and into the blizzard. The floor, 3 meters from an actively burning stove, stayed frozen because hot air rises. That is all. That is the entire reason. Kowalski heated the floor. He placed his firebox 1 meter below the living surface. He ran the combustion gases through 12 meters of serpentine stone channels that extracted the heat before it escaped. He let that heat saturate a deep stone thermal mass, and then he let physics do what physics always does, rise upward from the floor, through the space where his family lived, at the height where they actually needed it. 2 hours of firing each morning, 8 to 10 hours of warmth, a 4-year-old child asleep on the stone without a blanket. The system was not magical. It was not even complicated. It was correct. It worked because it accepted a physical law. Heat always rises, and built everything around that law instead of against it. That is the entire engineering insight. Stop the heat where a rise will be useful. 3 other civilizations found the same answer. Rome found it in the 1st century, building it into bathhouses and villas across an empire. Korea found it in the 14th century, building it into the literal floor of ordinary homes. Frank Lloyd Wright found it in the 20th century, calling it gravity heat, and placing it in a house that is now considered a landmark of American residential architecture. None of them knew about the others when they began. All of them arrived at the same solution, because the physics gave them no other option that worked. And the floor you may be standing on right now, if it is radiant, if it is warm, if there are pipes beneath the concrete carrying heated water, is the direct descendant of what Kowalski built in the summer of 1883 in North Dakota to keep his children alive. He never knew that. He never could have known that. He was a stonemason who solved a practical problem with materials he understood. He did not think of himself as a pioneer. He thought of himself as a man who needed his floor to be warm before winter. If this kind of quiet research-backed storytelling is why you come to YouTube, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video in this series asks a single question. How long before us did someone already understand this? And why did we forget? The next documentary in the Forgotten Engineering series is already in production. It follows a different person in a different winter who solved a different problem with the same kind of attention Kowalski brought to his floor. The pattern, it turns out, repeats. I'll see you there.